This is Jordan Edwards, and this is the Business Jiu-Jitsu Podcast.
Good afternoon. I'm here with Alexander Darwin. Alexander has a very interesting background. He's an author. He's a jiu-jitsu practitioner, and he has a book series of which I have read the first book, The Combat Codes, and I am about halfway through the second book. And I must say that this is quite an impressive work that you've put together and a world that you've built. And I'm really excited to talk to you and learn about you. Before we get into the book, would you mind just giving a little background on who you are, where you are, how you got into jiu-jitsu?
Sure, no problem. And thank you, Jordan, for having me on. I'm also a fan of the podcast. I've been listening to it, and you've had some really awesome guests. So I hope I can even live up to a little bit of what you've had on so far. But yeah, I as far as my jiu-jitsu background, I started training at university. I went to Boston University, and there was a club, and I really went into it with no wrestling background, very little martial arts, just kind of was brought along by a friend. And it was no-gi. It was run by an MMA fighter. And it was pretty grueling, but I fell in love. And that was the beginning of my journey. And I moved across the country to San Francisco for about 10 years and trained out there at an awesome gym right by the beach under a Half Gracie black belt named Carlos Sapon, and became great friends with him. And then when my wife and I were going to move back to Boston to be by our families, I obviously had to switch schools, and I got from my purple to black belt at Boston Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu under Roberto Maia, and that's where I started to teach about 7 years ago. Unfortunately, right now I haven't been training like I like to. I have a little bit of a lower back issue, which I know as we get older, practitioners encounter these sort of problems. So right now I'm in a stage where I'm really fiending, and I'm trying to do what I can to rebuild and stay off the mats. I have a baby coming in November, so my wife has me. I need to be in ship shape to take care of the third kid. So I need to make sure I'm not hobbling around at this point.
Yeah, of course. And you're from the Boston area?
I am.
Wife? Where did you grow up?
I grew up in Newton, Massachusetts,
Mm-hmm.
and my wife is from Natick, Massachusetts.
Okay, great. I went to Northeastern University, so I was right down the block from you at BU. And,
nice. Yeah, we might have been there around the same time, and I used to go over to the Northeastern area every so often.
Yeah. What year did you graduate?
I graduated 2005.
2005. Okay, so you're 2 years older than me. Yeah, I didn't get into BJJ until I graduated. I was a lacrosse player and competitive skier. I skied for Northeastern for 2 years, and I stopped playing lacrosse and I stopped skiing, and I needed something to fill that competitive juice. And when I graduated is when I found jiu-jitsu in 2009. So it's just such an amazing sport. You know, it really is an incredible way of life, and it's so much more than, you know, lacrosse and skiing. Those were their passions. I still love to ski, but jiu-jitsu just does so much more for you. Have you had that experience?
I have. And, you know, after having practiced it for such a long time and it being such an integral part of my life, and I know we'll probably delve into, you know, how it's affected my journey as an author. It is a bit of a double-edged sword, especially now being injured. Being off the mats, it's when you don't have it when you realize, you know, how important it is. But we know it's a long road, and I just want to be able to do this in my 70s, even my 80s. So I know that there's a lot of time to get back on the mats. Hey, I have a question. Did competitive skiing help your base? I know a lot of surfers. I've known a lot of actually professional surfers that have fantastic jiu-jitsu, and I think part of it is that base.
Yeah, I think so. It's kind of hard to say. I did a lot of yoga before I did jujitsu, and I felt like I've always made the comparison between the yoga helping my jujitsu. Because even though I'm a pretty big guy, I'm 6'2", 215, like ridiculously flexible for someone who's that big. Like I shouldn't bend the way that I do, but I really attribute that to doing a lot of yoga for 3 years. And I'm a golfer, and I'm not a very good golfer, by the way, but I always drew a lot of parallels between golf and jiu-jitsu, and like so few people that I did jiu-jitsu with are golfers, but I never put the skiing together with the jiu-jitsu. I don't know why. Maybe because it was just like two very distinct parts of my life and I hadn't connected them, but I can imagine all those years on the mountain definitely having an effect on my base and my stand-up. So yeah, my sensei always says that, and my judo professor, your root to the ground. And we talked about that a lot. So I'm going to have to really explore that. Yeah,
no, definitely. I definitely, as far as I said, the surfers that I know a lot of jiu-jitsu practitioners, especially, in Brazil or in San Diego, San Francisco, a lot of them are surfers, and some of them are pretty hardcore, and they usually are also very good at jiu-jitsu.
Yeah, that's surf. I just read Hickson Gracie's book, Breathe, and he talked extensively.
I haven't read it yet, but I've heard really good things.
It's a must read for all jiu-jitsu practitioners. And wow, did I learn a lot about the Gracie family that I didn't know. And I'm just going to leave it at that for all the listeners. But it's an absolute must read about the early days from one of the greatest jiu-jitsu practitioners of all time, from his perspective, which is very unique. But he talks a lot about surfing, his love of surfing and his love of jiu-jitsu. And those two things are very complementary, especially on the West Coast. For us on the East Coast, it's not to say there's no surf culture, but I don't think it's as prominent. So what's your background? Are you a full-time author, or is this a hobby? I mean, it's the book. Let me just say this. The work is more than a hobby. It is expertly done. It is phenomenal story building, character building. The writing is top notch. You never get lost. There's absolutely no mistaking the fact that this is a high quality work. So I guess my question is, are you making a living off of it?
Yeah, no. So that's a great question. And that means a lot coming from you. I know you're an author as well. And so you fully understand what it takes to make a high quality work. So the answer is no. I still run a small business on the side, marketing business, and that's, to support my family. And we're slowly edging closer to being able to, have writing be a full-time endeavor. However, we're not there yet. And, especially in the past 2 years, things have taken off quite, pretty well with combat codes. So I'm seeing the light at the end of the tunnel. However, I need to be very conservative with 3 kids, and make sure that we're paying the bills first and foremost. As much as I'd like to jump into it headlong, again, I need to make sure that most of all the family's taken care of. It does take a lot of work though. And right now, especially with the kids, writing, especially staying in a rhythm, it means finding those times in between everything else, between the regular work as well as, spending time with the family. It might be at night, it might be in the morning. I used to think I was like a morning writer, and I think I do get my best writing done, with a cup of coffee right when I wake up. It's kind of like that. I don't know if you have the same experience. It's kind of like that fuzzy time when your thoughts have not quite materialized. And I feel like I do my best writing then. I think it's kind of like especially with fiction, I find it to be a subconscious endeavor. If I'm too in my head, like later in the afternoon, it's almost like my thoughts are intruding on the writing. So I do think I'm a morning writer, but I haven't been able to do that all the time. You just got to make do. As I'm sure with business, you kind of just have to make do with what you have, and that is similar to jiu-jitsu. Whether you have an injury, your arms hurt, your back's hurt. If you are on the mats, you have to play the game that suits you.
Yeah. Well, I will clarify that while I am an author, I am not much of a writer. All of my works are nonfiction, and it is very much the narrative of my life and just recounting stories and things that happened to me. So there's not much creativity that goes into my writing outside of drawing parallels and teaching lessons, but it's just been my experience. And so all of my work that I've done is nonfiction, and your work is fiction, world building, character building, a narrative, creating a story. It's in my humble opinion, at least, it is something different than what I've done. I can't even compare myself to you. And I really
I wouldn't downplay what you've done as well. I think it's a different skill set. And nonfiction, I've written just a little bit of articles, and it's also very difficult in its own way. It's just a different skill set. It's like judo and JiuJitsu, perhaps.
Maybe. Maybe. What I think the listeners here and the jiu-jitsu community at a whole will appreciate about your work is the authentic nature of the way that you write about and describe and interweave martial arts into the character's experience. Do you want to give a little summary of the world that you've built and some of your inspiration behind it?
Sure. Yeah. The inspiration for the world to start was I just saw in fiction, film, TV, as well as literary fiction, science fiction, fantasy, a lack of realistic combat. Not that I like, I like martial arts movies. I like kung fu movies. That's kind of what I grew up on. Bruce Lee and even something like Crouching Tiger, those sort of, more far-fetched, aesthetically pleasing martial arts. But every time I saw, a piece of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu or grappling or realistic combat in film or even reading, I would just, I would read it over and over, and I would be so enthralled to see some realistic combat. So I essentially wanted to write a book that focused on that, and I decided that a world that replaced war with single combat, essentially gladiatorial champions representing nations in the place of armies, would be a really fun premise. So that's where I built up the structure from it, and I did my world building from that perspective, and from that point you really have to ask, how is this going to work? And you're going to poke a ton of holes in the plot, and how could this work? And then obviously, most importantly, develop a narrative as well as the characters around that.
Yeah, that's one of my favorite premises of the show, of eliminating war for this gladiatorial, and it's kind of like, oh man, it has like Harry Potter elements, and it has Game of Thrones elements, and it has there's so many things influence there. I don't know if those were your influences, but that I read from it, of the young gladiators going to train, and I just loved it. I mean, you reached out to me a couple months ago, and I bought it that day, and I threw it on my reading list, and then how always the same thing with books. It's like you keep getting a book, and then the list keeps getting wider and wider and wider.
The TBR pile.
Yeah, and then I'm so grateful that you reached out to me again and gave me that gentle nudge, and I was like, oh, you know what? And I popped it right to the top of the list. And
well, I knew you were a big reader, so I figured it would be right up your alley. And that concept of replacing war and armies with single combat and gladiators is just something I would think about when I was a kid, and it's kind of a cool concept to think that instead you would have a champion representing your entire nation. But then as far as the world building, a lot goes into that. Like, if you have to think from a you can't say realistic, because we're talking about science fiction, fantasy. How does that affect, if that were the case, how does that affect the world? Like, what would nations imagine if the outcome of UFC mixed martial arts fights determined how resources were allocated between nations? Now, what would nations do to make the best fighters? That's a question. We're talking, we have steroid use, of course, in modern mixed martial arts, but we're talking the next level if everything was on the line. On how these fighters performed.
Yeah, it's an amazing premise for not just a book, but on an entire world. And that's one of the things that, as soon as I got into the first couple chapters, and I started to understand kind of where you were going and learning about the world. I was like, oh, I see where this is going. And I kind of saw the I guess I could say the potential, the big P, you know, the thing that makes this kind of juicy and exciting. And then I was just like, and I just, you know, I wanted to, the main character's name is Seago, and he goes on this journey of finding himself and taking his innate talents, but then he has to match them up against all the people that he encounters in his new school of fighting. And it's just a great premise. I don't want to turn this into me just being fanboying out on this piece of work, because I do want people to go and read this, especially lovers of jiu-jitsu and martial arts and mixed martial arts. And you must have some kind of background in judo also, or you've trained in judo, because it is omnipresent.
I would say badly. I've been thrown a lot. I know a lot of very accomplished judo practitioners, sambo, judo, and I would say I'm more on the receiving end of that practice.
There must be an appreciation, though.
Oh, I love, you know, I really love, especially I teach jiu-jitsu, not right now for the back, but we get wrestlers, as you know, you get wrestlers, you get judokas, you get, you know, sambo practitioners. And what I say to them when they come is it's all good. It's all grappling. It's all, you know, a different rule set, part of the grappling whole. And we can all learn from each other in so many ways. So I really do appreciate all the different grappling arts, as well as striking. I mean, again, I've done, you know, several years of Muay Thai. I really didn't like getting hit very much. Walking out of even sparring class and having a bit of a headache was not my thing. But I very much, I love the beauty of Muay Thai and all the boxing, all the different striking arts. It's all beautiful to me.
Yeah. One of the things you were talking about earlier was getting up in the morning and getting to your writing process and having that cup of coffee and trying to figure out how to optimize your best writing. Did you ever read the book, The Art of Learning by Josh Waitzkin?
I have read excerpts of it, and I know he's one of Marcelo's black belts, and I've heard so many great things. I have to get around to actually reading the full thing, but yeah. I've heard it's fantastic.
Yeah, he's Marcelo's first black belt. He's Marcelo's business partner in his gym, and they have an online platform also. And what I think is interesting is that he's also a coach to some of the highest level performers on Wall Street and other industries. Before he was Marcelo's black belt, he was also a chess prodigy, a child chess prodigy up until the age he was 18. And then he left chess to pursue Tai Chi push hands, which is the martial art of Tai Chi, I believe, or so one of those martial arts over there. I forget which one. That's what led him to Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. But through his process of high performance, he often talks about your routine. He often talks about getting up in the morning and what you do. What's the first thing that you do before you go to sleep at night? What's the first thing that you do in the morning? And so I was interested that you brought that up as kind of one of the first frame of references, is like how you're optimizing your writing and testing it out at night and testing it out in the morning. My question to you is, has jiu-jitsu or martial arts carried over into other aspects of your life where you're able to optimize parts of your life or optimize parts of your writing? Are there clear parallels that like you think about?
Oh yeah, for sure. 100%. I would say one of the most clear was just building a pretty strong work ethic in me, as far as jiu-jitsu having such a clear cut path towards putting in work on the mats, putting in hours, and that having a real result in performance. I was never that much of an athlete in high school. I was never very competitive. It wasn't until, even academically, I was not very competitive. It wasn't until I found Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu that I was able to have something in my life that correlated so tightly for, you know, obviously you start with some predetermined athleticism based on your body type, age, all sorts of all sorts of kind of inherent skill sets. But it wasn't until jiu-jitsu came around that I found that if I put more mat hours in, I would then be able to perform the techniques that I practiced. They're definitely more subtle influences from jiu-jitsu. One that I've actually been thinking about a lot is skillful versus unskillful practice. Actually, I was thinking about this in relation to taking care of kids, and just how I'm about to have my third kid, and just how much better suited, at least my wife and I think we are, at, child rearing. And I mean, I know you have 2 kids. Anyone knows that the first kid is always just such a shit show, because you have no idea what you're doing. No matter what you say, no matter how many books you read, we've all read, every single book on getting them to sleep and feeding them. You don't know. And it's about not having the mat hours. And I think one thing I recognized with that is just recognize what is unskillful. It's kind of a paradox. If you think about jiu-jitsu, I think one of the when I teach new students, I think one of the things that I've found successful is almost less so pointing out what to do and more so pointing out what not to do. And I think for jiu-jitsu, it works really well because it's so broad. I mean, if you're coming from a 0 grappling basis, I mean, obviously you have basic instructions, like if you're actually sparring, you're supposed to, submit your opponent or control them. And that's easier said than done for someone with no experience. So there are certain rules or basics that you can tell them not to do, like don't give up your back, right? Pretty basic things. Don't bench press. Like, that's a basic one we hear. When you're getting mounted, don't bench press someone off you with your strength. That'll likely get you arm barred unless you have more skill. So I think it's a paradox in that for any of these skills, you're supposed to know what the unskillful acts are before you're skilled. And when you get more skilled, then you can more easily, once we're on the mats now, you can easily know from your own body or from watching someone what is unskillful, what is not efficient.
Yes.
And that's something I think I've taken, in writing, is something I've been actively looking for, is when I'm writing, either the act of writing at the present time, or, the longer strategy of writing an entire book, meaning drafting, editing, everything that goes into it. What is skillful and what is unskillful? And I think I'm always looking for what's unskillful, because that kind of whittles down, sculpts what you're trying to do. So that's definitely something I think is a bit more subtle, but always looking for that negative space, the unskillful acts, has been beneficial to me.
Yeah, that's a really good point. That mirrors my conversation with John Danaher, when we were talking about learning heuristics, and you brought up no bench pressing, or don't give your back, or the 2-arm or no arm principle. And learning these principles quicker can help you get better at jiu-jitsu. When I was talking to Kit Dale, he said the same thing. He very famously got his black belt in 3 years, and he said what he realized very early on was not any one technique, but just general rules about jiu-jitsu. Like, for example, when they post on their hand, he figured that if he could just break away a post, he was able to off balance them. And if he could just get his weight under any point, he could sweep them. So it wasn't that he was learning sweeping techniques. It was just learning the principle of sweeping. And he found that he was able to sweep people left and right. So I find that very interesting here to what you're talking about as it relates to writing. 2 people who kind of, I guess I got turned on to about the writing process were, one, Joe Rogan. I don't know if you listen to Joe Rogan's podcast, but he's constantly talking about his writing process and how he writes, and that he goes, sometimes late at night when he gets home from a show and he pours a glass of wine. In his case, he smokes up a blunt and then he starts banging away. And as long as he just always does that, and he just always goes back to the keyboard. And then the other one was Stephen Pressfield in The War of Art, and in his book, and he just talks about the grind of what it takes to be a professional writer and just go back to that keyboard every single day. It's writing or business or anything, generally speaking, is that mat time. It's just, you have to go. You have to go as much as possible.
Yeah,
and do as much as possible.
I think for writing, one of the things that, you know, if I'm talking to, I am a newer writer, given, you know, some writers have hundreds of books under their belt, and it really comes down to writing time, just like mat time. I think actually that's another thing that I've taken from jiu-jitsu that a lot of, you know, aspiring writers should look to. They almost see writing as if it's a innate skill that people just have, and I find that so silly. That would be the same as thinking that playing the violin is something that you just start without putting any practice in, or, you know, jiu-jitsu as the same. Whereas I don't think that many people realize that it's something that, you know, Stephen King is, how many words has that guy written? Or, you know, how many words have any of these very established authors written? They're putting in their mat time, and they're constantly improving on their craft. It's not about, I mean, again, you're going to start with a certain level of proficiency based on, you know, what you've done as a child and your education, etc. But that's really just the starting point. It really is about just putting in the hours of writing, and you know, writing shit, like really not writing good stuff, and putting it away, and then continuing.
Yeah. So I have a couple questions about some of the themes in the book. I want to try to be delicate about this, because obviously some of the people haven't read the book, so I want to set it up right. But the essence of the name, the combat codes, is kind of like this, the code that the Grivar, this race of people in your book, that they live by. And the first precept of the combat codes is, we fight so that the others don't have to. And what becomes very clear is that all of the people and the gladiators have all different relationships with these codes. Some of them live very strictly by the code. Some of them think they're bullshit and they just want to fight. I'm a street fighter. It's very similar to what we live through. It's like, it's the martial code, you know, the way of living life. Some people look at martial arts like they're monks and samurais, and everything they do in their life, they take very, very seriously. You have other people who are like this prototypical MMA fighter, who they don't even know anything about martial arts. And maybe some wrestlers wouldn't even consider themselves martial artists. They're just scrappers and fighters. I found like some really deep moments in the book, especially as it related to the relationship between some of the characters, where there's one character in your book, Murray, who is this a former champion who's kind of fallen from grace a little bit. And he, you know, the way that he's someone who really lives by the code. And then he looks at some of the bureaucrats in his position and people who don't maybe follow the codes as closely. This is something that really interested me in the book. And the reason why, and the parallels between business and also jiu-jitsu. And I hope that you just let me break this down a little more, and then I really want to hear your opinion on this. It got me thinking a lot about mentors and the people who teach us jiu-jitsu, and what you're supposed to expect from them and demand from them. Like, are people who teach you jiu-jitsu supposed to be saints in every single part of their life and be perfect martial artists? And in business, are your business mentors supposed to do everything perfect and everything right? Or is it sometimes gray? Are there sometimes 50 shades of gray? So I'm very interested. I think that this is a very, very, very important part of getting better at anything in life. And I'm interested to know, like, your intentions behind this theme in the book, the theme of the code and mentors, and just.
Yeah, no, that's a great question, Jordan. Maybe I'll just, I definitely have an opinion about this in outside of the book, as far as how mentors, especially in martial arts, play a role. And I think it's always important, because I've thought about this a lot. I think it's always important to consider the relationship between the student and the teacher. And I think some of the way that Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, especially students relate to their teachers, have been kind of a vestige of the way things were. So, I mean, the martial art we practice obviously started in Brazil, and before that started in Japan. And the way that martial arts were studied, to some extent back then, were a lot more serious. I mean, right now we're most practitioners like me are hobbyists. I mean, this is not our profession. I'm not a professional competitor. I do it because I love it, and it's a way of life for sure. But at the end of the day, I'm not living at my school, and my teacher is not, almost to an extent, like a father figure. I think a lot of old school practitioners, depending on how far you go back, may have grown up in a situation where their teacher literally was, maybe putting clothes on their back, and they were spending every hour of every day on the mats, maybe living at the school. So really the teacher was taking a different role at that point, which makes sense that someone was taking guidance from that person outside of the actual practice of the martial art. They were providing them life guidance, how to be a good person, how to do all sorts of things. Now, I think we're running into some friction nowadays because we still have those old vestiges of that, mentor-student relationship, but we're living in a different world where, you have paying students, and a lot of schools, their main purpose is as a business. Obviously, they have good reasons to be running a school outside of that, but it is a business, and that's how a lot of people see it. So I think there have had to be adaptations on how that relationship is treated. So my personal, just given where I stand as a teacher, my personal advice to my students is anything you ask me outside of jiu-jitsu, you should not only take with a grain of salt, but you should consider me somewhat of an idiot, because unless it's a specialty, I mean, you could certainly ask me on, my experience as a dad so far, or my experience as an author, any of the places where I have some competence. I'm glad to provide whatever advice I can, but you should, this is not, and even as far as jiu-jitsu goes, I mean, as we know, there's so many different ways to do it, and there are so many more experienced practitioners than me. So I always like to keep a really open mind with that, and tell my students to go elsewhere to seek knowledge and find what works best for them.
Yeah. Very well said. I've been very lucky to have as one of my primary mentors my father in business, and he's a very unique man. And he said something to me early in my career, which was hard for me to digest at the moment, but he said something to the effect of, you and your generation are coming up, and at some point you're going to push my generation out of the way, and you guys are going to become the leaders, and the students, and the student will become the teacher, essentially, to your point, and you will become the leaders, and you will be the people running industries. And now that I'm at the more of a midpoint in my career, as that's kind of happening, and my father has a very small operating role in many of our businesses, and I'm running a number of businesses, I make that parallel into jiu-jitsu also as I move up. And I see the way that some schools and affiliations run almost like the leader is a guru, like a sacred cow. And I think that's very, very dangerous. I just thought that the way that you wrote about it in your book was presented in such a great way to really look at some of the relationships between the way that people look at the codes, the rules, the unwritten rules, the respect, the honor. And I think that those things are so great and should be idealized up until a point. And there's so many shades of gray in between. And the way that you can look at some of these mentors, the way that kind of Seago, the main character, looks at Murray, this guy who's fallen from grace a little, and Murray looks at some of his fellow scouts and the people who are running the school, holding them to these high standards, only to find out that there's just so much more underneath. And that's kind of, it really does relate to something that I'm trying to get at the heart of my new book, Business Jiu-Jitsu, because so very often my teammates and younger students at the gym, they come to me and they want to talk about business, and I want to give them advice, and I want to show them the parallels between jiu-jitsu and what they're learning and growing and business. And so often there's mentors and people on TV and all of these voices kind of like coming at people from every single direction. And more often than not, my advice to them is very similar to yours, which is different people can teach you different things. And to your point before, sometimes it's what not to do. It's what to take away from what you're doing. And I just find that so often in the Jiu-Jitsu Academy, like there's all these different people, there's a doctors and garbage men, and every single one of them has something to teach you. And so I was just really pleased to read some of those themes in your book, obviously through the lens of the story, but I'm going to be writing about something similar as it relates to hierarchy and mentors, because you see that in corporate America also a lot. You see the kind of bureaucracy that you write about. I thought you did a really good job at taking something that is very complex for some people to understand, and kind of breaking it down and looking at some of the decision makers that people at different authority levels had to go through. Like, they made that decision. And then you find out why they made that decision. And you say, oh, actually, I can kind of relate to that. So, I know that most of the people haven't read this book, but
no, you hit it on the nail there, Jordan. As far as I definitely was influenced in creating that bureaucracy and the relationship with Murray, Siegel to Murray, and then Murray to the greater bureaucracy of what's called the Citadel, which is essentially this almost political organization that creates the fighters. And obviously, given the stakes that the fighters are facing and representing their nations, that there would be politics that plays into it. It's not straightforward like it should be, quote unquote. And what I think about a code of honor, I'm greatly influenced by like samurai culture, and that's partly where it comes from, the code of Bushido. There's a great book called Hagakure, which has a lot of Bushido quotes within it. But the thing with any code of honor, whether modern or ancient or made up, fantastical or not, is that having a strict code that you cannot waver from has positives as well as negatives. The positive, it means that hopefully that it's a good code of honor and it's moral and just, and that will lead you in the right direction as far as having a positive effect on yourself and your family as well as the outside world. However, having a rigid code of honor can also have disastrous effects, as we've seen throughout history, where even if every villain thinks the number one rule of writing bad guys is that they have to think they're good guys, right? Otherwise they're not believable. So every villain's code of honor they think is a just code that they're trying to impose on other people. And I think that is a negative of having those things. So exactly to what you're saying, I think for kids nowadays, I'm sounding old here, getting so much advice from social media and they're scrolling Instagram and getting quotes. And I think the most important thing is having a set of tools to learn. And that's just similar to grappling. Is more important than the actual techniques that you acquire are frameworks and tools for learning that then help you decide what to pick up and what to discard. And I would say that would go for what you're consuming, the information you're consuming. Especially nowadays, we have to be so alert into what we're taking in and what we're going to then apply towards our lives.
Yeah, I'm happy you brought up frameworks. It's a theme that's come up over and over and over again on this podcast. And one of the most important frameworks that I've learned through jiu-jitsu, which I brought with me to business and other parts of my life, is a technical framework of learning and getting better. Most people that work a 9-to-5 job, if they went to college, that was basically where their learning ended. And they may get a one-dimensional job where they're responsible for one thing, and there's not much room for advancement or growth throughout the course of their career unless they go back for some kind of advanced learning. versus what I brought from jiu-jitsu, which is this technical framework of constant learning, constant growth, constantly going back and taking classes and re-educating myself. And that's been so rewarding to me for my career. And I give jiu-jitsu 100% credit for finding that love of learning and reading and just wanting to get better and better and better, because at the beginning of my career, my natural talent only took me so far. I got to a point where that was it, and I didn't have the answers anymore. And there was this very famous story. It was in my first book where I went to go meet with this all-star private equity guy, and he started quizzing me on my business, and I didn't have the answers to his questions. And he looked me dead in the eye and said, "You're a really nice guy, but you don't know enough about your business." And that lit up a fire underneath me to say, I better go figure this stuff out. And it was all jiu-jitsu. It was really all the lessons every single night when my sensei was giving his talks on jiu-jitsu and his philosophy on martial arts. It was like he was talking to me about business. And I would have been going through something that day, some hard thing that I wouldn't want to do. And the jiu-jitsu lesson was like, it was like he was speaking to my soul on business. It was great. So yeah, your book really did the same thing for me, even though it was through the martial lens. A lot of the codes in here there's some deep themes, a lot of things to unpack and explore. One of the things I'd love to see, I tried looking for it in the book, but it's like, I guess this is one of the, hopefully it will come down the road, is like supplements to the book. Like I want a copy of the combat codes from the book, you know, and like, I want fan art. I want to see these characters come alive. I want the combat codes wiki, you know, like all the things that I loved about it.
There are some things in line, which I can't talk about right now, that I'm super excited about, that I'm writing outside of the combat codes universe, but I'm hoping also to jump back into it. I still think there's the world that I created. I'd love to jump back into it. I completed the arc of the first 3 books. It's set to be a trilogy, but there's always certainly room for prequels and sequels.
Yeah. Just I remember in high school, I took a class on Tolkien and the world building of Middle Earth and the maps and the characters. And then more recently, of course, it's been Game of Thrones. Like, just wanted to learn and read and do more of the Game of Thrones. And so now I have another world that I got to dig into, and I'm extremely grateful that you reached out to me. And I want to keep in touch and keep hearing more about what you got going on. And as you produce more content, please make sure that I'm on your short list of people to let know about it. And just wanted to let you know it's been a pleasure speaking with you, and also I'm a fan. So
thanks so much, Jordan. I appreciate you having me on the podcast, and I'll keep listening. You've had some great guests, and I definitely appreciate what you're doing here as well.
Yeah, thank you so much. Now, before you go, let me just share your Instagram here so that people can find you. Here you are, combat codes, and I shared it before, but I'm going to share it again. Here is where you can find the book on Amazon. The Combat Code Saga. And the second book is Grievar's Blood. And the third book, which I have not dug into yet, is this it? Blacklight Born? Why did I think it was called something War?
Well, the original working title for the third book was Grievar's War, and then it became Blacklight Born. And also, if anyone prefers audiobooks, all 3 are out via Audible.
And I'm so happy that you brought that up, because it was actually one of the things that I wrote down that I wanted to speak to you about. Whoever did your audiobook knocked it out of the park on the voices. I had my first book, This Is It. It turned into an audiobook, and my dad and I wrote it together. I thought the guy that did my dad's voice did a great job. The guy that did my voice, I didn't connect with it. Not that he did a bad job technically, but I just don't like the recording. Whoever did your audiobook did a fantastic job.
Yeah, his name is David Sweeney Bear. He's a guy from the UK, and it's funny that when I wrote the book, I had all the names. You pronounce names and places a certain way in your mind when you're writing. And then when he read it, it sounded so much better in the British accent, or he does a bunch of like brogues and British accents, Scottish accents. It just sounded so much better that when someone asks like, how do you pronounce this name? I just go with his version at this point.
Yeah, it was, that's interesting that you say that, because he did do a great job in that. And I'll leave it at that, but really he did a great job of bringing your world to life, and just wanted to thank you one more time. Alexander, pleasure. Please stay in touch, and look forward to talking to you again.
Thank you so much.